excerpt on your handout. Summer in Hawaii, an evening on Broadway, skateboarding in Florida, surfing in the Bahamas, the festival in Cannes, a weekend in Disneyland. What else? Skiing in the Carpathians, love in Paris, bordellos in Amsterdam, beer in Bavaria, hockey in Canada, reggae in Jamaica, roulette in Monte Carlo, skyscrapers in New York, cigars in Cuba, war in Yugoslavia, gold in Alaska, hunting in Africa, immigrants at Brighton Beach, terrorists in Palestine, nirvana in India, oil in the Emirates, art in Montmartre, Gauguin in Tahiti, rock in Woodstock, Haidikiri in Kyoto, carnival in Brazil, healing in Lourdes, the Gioconda at the Louvre, death in Venice, the bazaar in Chernivtsi, corruption in high places, a bullfight in Toledo, a miracle in Milan, an inferno in the Tower, the Pope in the Vatican, the Tower in Babel, the bomb in Hiroshima, the rumba in Barbados, a caravan in the desert, the Queen of England, a sauna in Finland, Lenin in the mausoleum, shadows in paradise, the sarcophagus in Chernobyl, Can-Can in the Moulin Rouge, cheese and butter, bird in the hand, two in the bush, Lucy in the sky, islands in Oceania, Alice in Wonderland, the Fool in the Hill, in Vino Veritas, the festival that is always with you. This is wonderfully translated by Marko and published by Kivas recently. Now, the lengthiness and repetitive rhythm of this deluge of coordinates in this list simulate the dizziness experienced by inhabitants of the post-Soviet space, who suddenly were inundated with immense amounts of previously restricted data. Cities, countries, and nations are reduced to one convenient and efficient image. Easy to commingle these with figures such as Lenin and the Pope, as well as with popular songs, books, and phrases, in order to announce the arrival of Western pop cultural sensibilities to Ukraine. It was the 1990s. The West had come to Ukraine, and Ukrainians were coming to the West. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukrainian intellectuals were among the first to travel to the West. They represented Ukraine as ambassadors at various academic and cultural events. Zabushko's protagonist in field research, she travels between U.S. cities telling her American counterparts about Ukraine. Konstantin Moskalets's narrator in the novel Vechirny Med, Evening Mead, he travels to Munich and is given the opportunity to see how an intellectual lives in Germany, in Western society. In Yevgeny Kononenko's novel Imitation, we are told that its chief protagonist, Mariana, has studied art in Western Europe. Andryczyk Perfetsky, as we have seen, gives speeches about his homeland in Venice. Sometimes in her prose work of the Vysemdesiatniki, the Ukrainian intellectual acts as a pioneer of sorts, discovering the West and describing it from the point of view of a former citizen of the USSR. For example, in Dibrova's novel Burdik, the narrator manages to smuggle his way into the United States and spends time observing the peculiarities of life there. He later offers the reader a 2-page long description of an American supermarket. In several of the novels mentioned above, the Ukrainian intellectual functions as a go-between the West and with other citizens of Ukraine. This is particularly evident in the prose of Kononenko and Zabushko. Both in Polivito Svidjnia and in Imitatia, the female Ukrainian intellectual protagonists possess these main characters of theirs. They possess intelligence, beauty, and savvy, and they attract Western men, some of whom are in a position to help Ukraine. They function as conduits between Ukraine and the West, and this leads to a conflict in their personal lives. They face the dilemma of choosing between these men with their strange Western values in order to best serve their country, and Ukrainian men, who are predominantly depicted as being backward, timid, and unwilling to sway from the regulations of patriarchal Ukrainian society. One particular component of the West that is significant in the prose of the Vysemdesiatniki is the presence of, you guessed it, the Ukrainian diaspora. These emigres offer kind of a halfway point for these post-Soviet Ukrainian intellectuals visiting the West, because they're both Western and they're Ukrainian. It's this weird mix. And it is often with members of the Ukrainian diaspora that these intellectuals first make contact. It is by them that they were often invited to participate in various conferences and exchange programs. By depicting the relationship between these two types of Ukrainians, the Lithuanians are picking through diaspora perspectives and values, accepting some while rejecting others, as they construct this post-Soviet Ukrainian identity. Now initially, depictions of members of the diaspora are quite sympathetic. These men and women are shown to be staunch patriots of Ukraine and all things Ukraine. They devote their time and energy to the Ukrainian cause, and they have managed to maintain a Ukrainian identity outside their homeland. In Burdik, for example, the narrator describes a certain Lyubomir Brynchak, an emigre librarian who organizes Ukrainian sporting events and art openings in the United States. In Pольові дослідження українського сексу, the protagonist's contact point at the Pennsylvania University she is visiting is Mark, a professor of Ukrainian background who has been successful in inviting other intellectuals from Ukraine to the university. The diaspora is represented in Andryczyk's novel Rekreacja by Dr. Popper, a psychiatrist residing in Switzerland who arrives at the Chortopil Festival of the Resurrecting Spirit in Ukraine on an old Chrysler Imperial, and he gives two young Ukrainian poets a ride to the festival. As these novels progress, however, representatives of the Ukrainian diaspora take on a more negative light. Brynchak turns out to be a walking cliché of Ukrainian things. He invites the novel's narrator to a traditional Ukrainian Christmas meal, with all the meals and everything according to tradition. But Christmas is months away. Brynchak is shown to be less than helpful when the narrator asks if he can stay with him for a while, and he says, well, there's a church down the street, I got plenty of room. Zabushko makes sure that the reader is made aware that this Professor Mark, who invites all these intellectuals to the West, is only doing so because he's got problems at home and just gets them out of the house. She makes a point of showing this. Finally, Dr. Popper is continually ridiculed by the young poets who are hitching a ride with him to the festival. And in parting, they are referred to him as an old mudak. Almost like a moron. It's a very negative term. In fact, Popper, as we later see in the novel, turns out to be not just an old mudak, but a demon who attempts to drag one of the poets into a sacrifice ritual. As the examples above illustrate, newfound access to the West was very influential on the first wave of post-Soviet prose. The cult of the West and its materials are both sustained and ridiculed in these works. Western things in the West itself appears in the prose, and Ukrainian intellectuals assume the duty of discovering, investigating, and filtering these artifacts and traits as they search for the post-Soviet Ukrainian identity. It is a search that consumes these intellectual protagonists, and it often damages them as a result. The aura of celebration that marked the early years of Ukrainian independence and the opening up of previously inaccessible worlds that accompanied it were also quickly joined by the general disorientation for the Ukrainian intellectual as the 1990s progressed. Having led the calls for reform and having manifested the energy of change in their art, Ukrainian artists once again found themselves on the periphery of a Ukraine controlled by former Communist Party leaders, freshly repackaged as National Democrats. The disillusionment of the Ukrainian intellectuals stemming from this is expressed in the prose of the Lithuanians, where the Ukrainian intellectual protagonist is frequently depicted as being different, or abnormal, or sick. Zabushko's Pольові дослідження, in many ways, is an extended rant exposing the various ills infecting all of Ukraine, more specifically the Ukrainian woman, and even more specifically the Ukrainian female intellectual. Incapable of coming to terms with her nation's cruel history and ignoring its present maladies, she becomes infected with the ills of her people and suffers from this. The artist applies art to this wound in hopes of eventually curing it. And this is the third excerpt you have there. A short course in psychology, the road to mental health. Find the reason and the problem goes away. Why hasn't anyone thought of doing this with nations? You neatly psychoanalyze the whole national history and poof,